Hi everyone, Speederice here with a companion video to my timeline video. So with packaging aside, let's look at some of the cards in the game. Some of the cards I already showed you were the character cards, which are very cleverly printed on the back of Cusco employee IDs. So I believe Andrew Looney, the creator of the game, said that he imagined the future as a place where everyone kind of works for this one conglomerate company, Cusco, and this is based off of Marty McFly's ID card that he scans in Back to the Future Part 2. So these are all descendants of the characters in the movie from alternate timelines into the future. And your goal is to set into motion the events that will bring about your character's timeline, your character's existence. However, the tricky part of this game is that the other characters, the other players that are playing the game with you, may have another version of the timeline that they'd like to set up, which is counterintuitive to yours. I talked a little bit about Vern in my other videos, so I'm not going to use him as an example. I'll use Marty McFly the Third. Now, as you can see with Marty McFly the Third, in order for him to come into existence, George needs to get his story published. Him and Lorraine need to become parents, so that way Marty McFly Sr. will come into existence. We still need Marty and Jennifer to have their kind of not so great life, so that way Marty McFly Jr. will come into existence. So they still need to go and get married in the Chapel of Love, all the things that we saw in Back to the Future Part 2. However, Doc and Marty need to succeed in their mission of keeping Marty McFly Jr. out of jail. I guess for some reason if Marty McFly Jr. goes to jail, then Marty McFly the Third can never come to be. But just how does a player turn the events of the timeline in his or her favor? Well, as we Back to the Future fans know, in order to change any timeline, you're going to need a time machine. And if you're lucky enough, you'll draw one of these different versions of the time machine. I'll show you how they look because the artwork on these is just fantastic. So this is the most powerful time machine. This is the time train. Basically it's fully equipped, which I'll explain what that means later. But this is the most powerful time machine in the game. This is the one that you want, because not only can you play this and change the timeline, but you're also allowed to play another card, which in this card game, the one thing you're really going to want to do is play as many cards as possible. And under the rules of the game, you're only allowed to draw a card, and then you can play only one card on your turn. And that is kind of difficult. So this will allow you basically a free play, and you get to change the timeline. This is the second best card in the game, and some would argue it might be better than the time train depending on the circumstances. This is time card version 3. This is what we see at the beginning of Back to the Future Part 2, and this car is fully equipped. Again, basically it doesn't need anything special to run it. You only need garbage to put in Mr. Fusion. As you can see, this is the one with the hover circuit, hover conversion, and everything is just a-okay. And this card allows you to draw another card after you've played it, so you can change the timeline and then you can draw another card. And drawing is important too, because like playing a card, you can only draw once per turn unless you have another card that says something else. So this card allows you to get another card out of the pile. This is time car version 1, as we see it fresh off of the back of the trailer. This time car is pretty cool, but as you can see, it needs plutonium. That was Marty's big issue in Back to the Future Part 1. So in order to play this time car to change any of the timelines, you will need either the pellet of plutonium on your side of the field, the field to play, and you can discard this card and then change time when you discard this and the time card. But basically it's one pellet, one trip, so once you discard this, everything is done. You've only changed time once. Or you could have the case of plutonium, and this is what you really want, this combination right here, because once you play your time car and change the timeline, you can put the time car back into your hand and you can play it again on your next turn, because you have an entire case of plutonium to use. So that's pretty clever how they use the items and the cars, as we see in the movies, and they have their little weaknesses. But this card is still pretty powerful as long as you have that case of plutonium out in front of you. I should have gone in probably chronological order, but I've gone in the order of time machines that are most useful to you in the game. This is Time Car version 4. This is what we see in Back to the Future Part 3 with the 50s wheels, and as Marty's about to go back to 1885. This is called the Old and Cranky because this one has been buried in the mine for so long. And to play this time car, you need to discard a card from your hand. It's not a big deal. It's not like you need an item like some of the other ones. So this one's still pretty playable, and I think that's because in the movies this car was pretty good. I mean, you know, it had Mr. Fusion. It just needed some new time circuits, some new tires, and this one was good to go. It wasn't until Marty ran into the Indians and the gas tank was ruptured that he ran into problems. This is Time Car version 2, as we see in 1955 and at the end of Back to the Future Part 1. This car requires lightning to operate, so you need to have this item card, Lightning Prediction. In order to make this car work, you need to discard this card, and then you can use the Time Car version 2. But there's nothing else very special about that. I mean, it's one use and it's gone, just like in the movie. You know, once the lightning comes, it's pretty much done and over with. And this is Time Car version 5. This is the one on rails. This is sadly the last DeLorean that we see in the movie. It requires another item to push it, which, if you know from the movies, and if I had it ready here, it requires the overpowered locomotive to push the car to 88 miles per hour. And again, like Time Car version 2, once you play it, you have to discard the locomotive and you discard the time car. So there are different ways to change the timeline, and when I say change the timeline, I assume that you've watched my other video, but if you haven't, basically timeline cards look like this. This is one of the most powerful timeline cards. It changes all of these events in the timeline, and when you change, it lets you change these linchpin cards. You flip the card over to its alternate version, and you've now changed the timeline, and then you flip all these other cards that are listed as well. So as you can see in this alternate 1955, Biff Tannen has given the sports almanac to his younger self, and that's what I mean by changing the timeline. This is the most important mechanic in the game.